Hello students and welcome to this presentation on two topics in phonetics. We deal here with assimilation and elision, two concepts that deal with the way we speak and the changes that occur in the production of certain sounds in connected speech. So let's begin with elision. As we do that, I would like to invite your attention to that little cartoon strip where you have two children arguing over the pronunciation of the word present, where of course the t sound is not heard in speech. And that is precisely what elision is. In other words, the omission or the deletion of certain sounds in speech. So let us begin by observing certain differences between speech and writing. Writing, by and large, is a more formal means of communication compared to speech, as a result of which we normally take less liberties with language when it comes to writing in formal contexts. So consider these sentences. When you write a sentence like, I am writing a story, you write it with all the words intact. I am writing a story. So also a sentence like, my friend did this for me. But in speech, it is not with this kind of separation between the words where each word stands out individually that we speak. In fact, we compress a lot of these words in rapid speech, and we would be saying something like, I'm writing a story. We notice that the am there becomes compressed. We have omitted the a sound. The vowel sound a is deleted in connected speech, and we would speak the sentence as I'm writing a story. And the second sentence, we would hardly say my friend did this for me. We would, on the other hand, compress friend and did and together make it sound as one word. My friend did this for me. My friend did this for me. There is a blending that happens there. In other words, the d sound that the word friend ends with is omitted so as to make our speech sound more natural. Now, this process of omitting or deleting certain sounds in order to make our speech sound more natural is what is called elision. So, elision is the removal of an unstressed syllable, consonant, or vowel sound for the purpose of decreasing the number of syllables so that we are able to speak in a more natural manner, maintaining the desired rhythm. So it is a deletion, as we would have, for example, in a sentence like, the ball rolled down the hill, would be in speech rendered as, the ball rolled down the hill. Rolled and down become combined, and we avoid the d of rolled and make it sound almost like a single word. The ball rolled down the hill. In speech, similarly, look at a word like them or of or can, for example. CAN, that modal auxiliary is written as CAN, but in speech, in connected speech, we hardly ever make it sound as can. I can do it. I can do it. You can do it. We don't say it as you can do it. You can do it. No, in that context, we notice that the can has been compressed into a very weak form of the word, and it becomes can. Can. The a sound is omitted, and it's almost as if there is no vowel sound in between the k and the n sound. You can do it. I can do it. So that is elision. The word elision comes from the verb elide. To elide over something means to omit something. So, as I have already explained, it's the omission of a vowel, consonant, or syllable in speech. On the slide, you can see the remarks made by some eminent linguists about elision. I'll just read the one by Gimson there. Elision is a process of reduction, including the loss of phonemes. So, elision occurs basically to maintain the characteristic rhythm of speech, and we can observe elision especially occurring in the pronunciation of the weak forms of pronouns, of auxiliary verbs, and other functional words. So this table here would help you to identify the way in which we use the weak forms of functional words like pronouns, articles, prepositions, and conjunctions, and in which we normally have the elision of vowel sounds. I had, for example, I'd done it. I'd done it by then. Had, the her and the a, both the sounds are deleted and you get a compressed d in its place. So I'd done it. I'd finished the task by then. So here are some examples to help you identify the elision of vowels. Look at a phrase like get another. We don't pronounce the of the another in rapid speech, and very often we would pronounce it as get another. Get another book, please. Quite alone. In connected speech, it would be pronounced or rendered as quite alone. I felt quite alone there. Father and mother. In rapid speech would become father and mother. Father and mother. Father, the sound there is combined with the of and father and mother. Father and mother. The d sound of and, which is a conjunction and a weak form. We use the weak form of this conjunction. Father and mother. You don't say father and mother, father and mother. So these are situations where you have the elision of vowel sounds. In these phrases, we have the elision of consonant sounds. Next day. Next day in written forms would be next day in speech. Next day. The t sound, with which the word next ends, would be deleted in connected speech, and we would say next day. Left turn. Here again, the t, one of the t's is combined with the other one, and we delete it, and we end up saying left turn. We don't say left turn, left turn. That is the elision of consonant sounds. From elision, let's now move to assimilation, which is a similar process, but here we do not delete an entire sound. On the other hand, the sound undergoes a change. The quality of the sound changes. As it happens to the d sound in that phrase, blood pressure, as seen in that little picture. Blood pressure very often becomes blood pressure in speech. We don't say blood pressure. It often becomes rendered as blood pressure. The d sound of blood under the influence of the p that comes soon after it becomes blood pressure. Okay, so that kind of voice change or sound change, quality, not voice change, sound change. The change in the quality of the sound, that is what assimilation is. So, assimilation can be defined as the process by which a speech sound becomes similar or identical to a neighboring sound. It is always under the influence of a neighboring sound that a particular sound changes its quality. It begins to sound very much like that the neighboring sound. The term assimilation, it comes from a Latin root where it means make similar to. So a sound changes its quality and begins to sound very much like a neighboring sound. And this process is again something that happens naturally in speech across languages, all to make speech sound more natural. A few instances of assimilation will help you to understand the concept better before we move on to the different heads under which we study the different types of assimilation. So look at these contexts. Glad tidings. In a phrase like glad tidings, uh, in speech, we would tend to change the pronunciation of the d sound in glad, and we would observe that it becomes closer to the t that the next word begins with. Glad tidings, glad tidings. We notice that the d is hardly heard there. Glad tidings. The d becomes very close to the t of the next sound. So this is an example of assimilation. It's not elision because we do not avoid the sound fully. It's not glad tidings, it is glad tidings. The d is definitely there, but the way in which it is pronounced is different. Similarly, pink doll. The k of pink again undergoes change and it becomes closer to a g sound. Why does that happen? Because of the influence of the d sound that comes closer to it. Now, d is a voiced consonant and k is a voiceless consonant. Now, in the vicinity of a voiced consonant like d, the voiceless k will move towards a voiced position. So it becomes pink doll. We don't say pink doll. We say pink doll. The k becomes g. Pink doll, pink doll. Right. In the next word, lull, lull. You observe that there is some difference in the way the two l sounds are pronounced. L by itself is an alveolar sound which is pronounced with the tip of the tongue touching the roof of the mouth. But when it comes to the second L sound, you observe that there is a slight pushing back of the tongue. It is not exactly on the alveolar ridge that you have the tongue touching itself. It is in a slightly backward position, and this happens because of the a sound which comes immediately before it. So lull, lull. You notice that when you pronounce the second l, it becomes more of a post alveolar sound. Lull. There is definitely a difference between the first l and the second l, and the second l therefore undergoes assimilation. In the word comfort, comfort. Now the m sound normally is a bilabial nasal. But in a word like comfort, we notice that we do not fully realize the bilabial quality of m. It becomes more of a labiodental sound, and this happens because of the influence of the f that comes immediately after it. So observe for yourself the way you would pronounce this word comfort, comfort. Look at the manner of articulation or the position of the lips when you say the m in comfort. Say m by itself, m. It's clearly a bilabial sound and it's a nasal sound. But when you say m in comfort, you notice that we do not take it to as much of a bilabial position as we would when we pronounce the sound m by itself. Here it becomes more of a labiodental sound. The lower lip touching the upper teeth, labiodental, which is how the f is pronounced. Comfort, comfort. Similarly, in a phrase like 10 million, the n sound gets closer to m, 10 million. 10 million. You don't strictly differentiate between 10 and million there. We don't say 10 million, unless, of course, we need to stress the fact that it is 10 and not 5 million. It is 10 million. But in rapid speech, 10 million, the new aircraft costs 10 million. 10 million. The n there, it's not 10 million, but it is 10 million. There is obviously n in a differential or in a different manner. It is included in the pronunciation of 10 million, but it is realized in a different manner. And this happens because of the m sound that comes after it. So even though we have just identified assimilation in English in these examples, you need to remember that assimilation occurs in normal speech in various languages. It's a phenomenon across languages. Phonemes keep changing in order to be accommodated in rapid speech, and they begin to sound closer to the nearby sounds. Now comes the next stage, where we need to look at the different categories under which we can study these assimilatory changes: the progressive, regressive, full, partial kinds of assimilation. And we also need to realize, as you would have observed in the previous slide where I gave you some examples, that assimilation can sometimes be within a word, or it can be at a word boundary, that is, in between two words in a phrase. So let us now take a look at the first of these divisions. That would be between partial and full or total assimilation. Look at the phrase 10 bikes. In connected speech, the n of 10 would move closer to the sound that comes immediately after it, which is b. B is a bilabial sound, and n is an alveolar sound. Now, n would move closer to the bilabial sound in order to make the process of pronunciation or process of speech more natural. So, in all probability, we would say it as 10 bikes. So, 10 bikes parked outside the building. 10 bikes. You notice that the n has moved very close to the bilabial sound, and that would be m. N getting replaced by m because of the influence of b. Now, this is different from the change that n, the same n, undergoes in another phrase, like 10 mice. In connected speech, the n of 10 here, in all probability, would move very close to the m of the next sound. So it would be 10 mice. 10 mice in that room, 10 mice, 10 mice. It's not 10 mice, but it's 10 mice. The n becomes m. And here you notice that a word changes to become, or not a word, a sound. A sound changes and becomes the next sound. So it is a kind of total change. In the earlier instance, 10 bikes, it was a partial change because it moved very close to the next sound, 10 bikes. But it did not become, but we did not say 10 bikes, we said 10 bikes. Whereas here, it becomes the next sound. The assimilation changes it to the next sound altogether, 10 mice. So this is an example of total assimilation. The second major kind of assimilation involves phonemic and allophonic assimilation. Like the total and partial assimilation, you can study it under this head of phonemic or allophonic assimilation. In phonemic assimilation, the sound, the phoneme would change entirely, whereas in allophonic assimilation, you don't have the sound changing entirely, but the quality of the sound changes. You have allophonic variations of the same sound. So let's look at a few examples. In a word like, or a phrase like, that place, you notice that the t is replaced by a sound that a new sound which comes because of the influence of the sound that comes after it. So, under the influence of the per of place, ter of that changes. It becomes a new phoneme itself. So, you have in rapid speech, we would be saying something like that place. Let's go to that place immediately. We wouldn't say that let's go to that place immediately. That place immediately. That place. It's not that place, but it is that place. There is definitely the the sound per, which is part of that also. Here you notice that the phoneme ter has been replaced by the phoneme per under the influence of the per sound with which the next word begins. Now, in an allophonic change on the other side of the table, look at the change that comes in, let us say, g in the first phrase there, big wall, big wall. You know, g by itself, what kind of sound is g? If we apply the three-term label, we know that it is a velar sound. G, the place of articulation, makes it a velar sound. The velum is involved in it. What about the manner of articulation? It is a plosive. And then, is it a voiced sound or a voiceless sound? It is definitely a voiced sound, during the production of which the vocal cords vibrate. Now, when you say big wall, g, g, look at the position of the lips. G by itself involves a position very close to a lip stretch position. But in speech, when g comes in the close vicinity of a lip rounded sound, like w, for example, you notice that the lip position of g changes. So try to experience it yourself. Big wall, big wall. Look at the way your lips are positioned during the production of the g sound, big wall. It's definitely not in the way your lips would be positioned when you say g by itself, where you would have a move towards the stretched position. The lips would be more stretched in g by itself, but in the vicinity of the w sound here, in a phrase like big wall, we notice that g becomes lip rounded. So that is an allophonic change. The phoneme does not change here. G does not get replaced by k or any other sound, but it becomes a slightly different version of the g sound. In other words, an allophonic variant of g, as it would happen in the sound m in meat, for example. M. M by itself is a bilabial sound, but there is definitely no lip spread involved in the production of m by itself. But in a word like meat, under the influence of the e vowel, which is a lip spread, which has lip spread in its production, the m also becomes a lip spread variant. Me, look at the m, the m. We don't say me, m in meat as we would say m normally by itself. So m here also gets changed. It is an allophonic variant of the m sound. So these are examples of allophonic and phonemic assimilation. A phonemic assimilation, or a in phonemic assimilation, the phoneme changes, a new sound is heard, whereas in allophonic assimilation, the quality of the sound changes. The sound remains the same, but there is some change either in its manner or place of articulation. The third division or category under which we can study allophonic changes would be by observing the position where the change occurs. In other words, it may be within a word or it may be at a word boundary. So within a word, we've already seen some of the examples in the earlier slides, like comfort, for example. We notice that the m changes because of the f sound that comes after that, and that is obviously a change within a word. Here's another example. The k sound, for example, in a word like key or scheme. The k sound here changes under the influence of the e sound, and k is not a fully velar sound as it normally is or by itself is, and it becomes a more of a pre-velar sound under the influence of the e vowel sound that comes after it. So within the word you find the assimilation occurring in the production of the k sound. Ki. You don't say k, where the k would be pronounced as it normally is in the velar position. Here, under the sound influence of e, it becomes a pre-velar. The place of articulation becomes it's in a slightly forward position, not in the backward velar, pure velar position, but in a pre-velar position that you have, or pre-velar point that you have, the place of articulation, key. So that is an example of assimilation within a word. As we have seen in earlier examples like 10 million or 10 bikes and all those other examples that we discussed, sometimes the assimilation may be at a word boundary. That is, a sound undergoing a change because of the sound that comes at the beginning of the next word or at the end of the previous word. As for example, in a word like, for example, San Francisco, the n of san becomes more of a labiodental sound. It's not a labiodental sound. N is a alveolar sound, whereas in San Francisco it becomes closer to the labiodental sound under the influence of the labiodental f, which comes after it. San Francisco, the n at the boundary of san changes to a labiodental sound under the influence of the next sound that comes at the beginning of the next word. in front, the house is in front of the lake, or there is a lake in front of the house. In front, the n changes to a labiodental one. So that is an example of an assimilation at a word boundary. And the last of these categories would be the progressive and regressive kinds of assimilation. In other words, which word or which sound undergoes the change because of which sound. That is, a sound may change because of the sound that comes before it or the sound that comes after it. So depending on that, you can categorize the change as either progressive or anticipatory. In progressive assimilation, a phoneme changes the quality of the phoneme that comes after it. So that there is some kind of progress. You're moving forward. One sound changes the sound that comes after it. For example, look at the sound l in words like please, for example. The l becomes a voiceless sound. L by itself is a voiced sound, but when it is combined with a p sound before it, very often the voiced quality of l changes and it becomes more of a voiceless or a devoiced consonant, devoiced sound. So please, the l changes from a fully voiced kind of sound to a voiceless or a devoiced kind of sound. Why? Because of the influence of the voiceless p. P is a voiceless plosive, and it is, it exerts its pressure or influence on the l that comes after it. So it is a progressive change. Of course, this changes within the word. You can think of such changes at word boundary too, but I'll not confuse you with that further example right now, but understand that the progressive change is one that involves the sound changing, the sound that comes after it. It can be, on the other hand, a regressive or anticipatory change. Here, the phoneme changes the quality of the earlier phoneme. As we said earlier, we looked at a word like meat, for example. We said that the the production of the m sound changes because of the e sound that comes after it. So here you have a going back. The later sound influences the earlier sound. So that is why it is called a regressive or anticipatory change. So the one sound anticipates the sound that comes after it and it changes in accordance with that. So a phonemic change that involves a phoneme that, or in other words, the regressive or anticipatory assimilation is one where you have a phoneme changing the quality of the earlier phoneme, the phoneme that goes before it. As for example, in a phrase like 10th month, 10th month. What is the change that occurs here? A 10th and month. You know, the n in both these words, in 10th and month, it becomes more of a dental sound. Why? N is not a dental sound by itself. It is an alveolar sound. But in a word like 10th or in a word like month, you will notice that the place where the n is pronounced or produced is in a position closer to the teeth, dental. Why? Because it is very strongly influenced by the dental sound, th, that comes after it. So it becomes 10th, 10th. It is not a fully alveolar sound as it normally is, the n, but it becomes more of a dental sound. So here the sound n is changed by the sound that comes after it. The sound n undergoes a change because of the influence of the sound that comes after it. So that is regressive or anticipatory change. You can put it the other way and say the th sound changes the sound n that comes before it. So it depends on which sound changes because of which one. In progressive, one sound changes the quality of the sound that comes after it. In regressive or anticipatory, a sound changes the quality of the sound that goes before it, that went before it. So we have seen the different heads under which allophonic changes may be categorized. But in all these changes, we also need to know what is the nature of the change. Even when they are categorized under the heads like partial or total or allophonic or phonemic or progressive or regressive or at word boundary or within a word, the changes that occur are basically of four kinds. So now we need to look at the nature of the changes that come in assimilation. And that can be categorized under four heads. The changes may be those involving the place of articulation. It may be one involving voice, that is voiceless becoming voiced and voice becoming voiceless. It may be assimilation involving lip position, and it may be a change or assimilation involving nasalization. So we'll look at these four different kinds of changes. And to understand it better, we will categorize these changes, or we look at examples that are within a word and at word boundary too. So the first kind of change is one that involves the change in place of articulation. Assimilation, where a sound changes its place of articulation. Look at the example of the sound d in a word like dress. Now d. D is an alveolar sound. But under the influence of the r that comes after it, r, the place of articulation is r, of r is behind the alveolum, and therefore d also undergoes a change and d becomes a post alveolar sound. Not the full d in this word, in a word like dress, is not a full alveolar sound. It undergoes the place of articulation of d changes. It is still d, but the place of articulation gets shifted slightly. So it becomes a post alveolar sound. It is still an alveolar sound, but not a full alveolar sound, a post-alveolar sound. And why does that happen? Because of the influence of the r sound that comes after it. So that's an example of an assimilatory change involving a different place of articulation, or involving the sound getting produced in a different place within a word. Now, the same change can occur at a word boundary too. For example, in a phrase like red rose, it is the same phenomenon that happens here. The d changes because of the influence of the r that comes after it. But here you can notice that the change is at a word boundary. D ends a word and r comes after it. It is also an example of an anticipatory or regressive change. A red rose, the r changing, the d that goes before it. It is at a word boundary, and it is an assimilatory or an allophonic change. It is not a phonemic change, it is an allophonic change. The quality of d changes. It becomes a post-alveolar sound because of the influence of r. Red rose. You don't say red rose, red rose. The d becomes post-alveolar. Try to say it for yourself. D. D by itself, and d as in dress. D by itself and d as in red rose, red rose, red rose. D. You don't say red rose. D. D in the alveolar position sounds unnatural there. So to make it sound more natural, you make it a post-alveolar d, red rose, which makes it sound very natural. The second kind of change involves voice, that is, a voiced sound becoming voiceless, or vice versa, a voiceless sound becoming voiced, again under the influence of a neighboring sound. This can again be within a word or at a word boundary. Let us look at two examples. Look at the L. We've already analyzed this example. The L undergoing change because of the P that comes before it. P is a voiceless sound, voiceless consonant, and under the influence of that voiceless sound, P, the L, which is by itself a voiced consonant, loses its voiced quality and it becomes more of a voiceless or a devoiced consonant. Please, play. So this is an example of assimilation involving voice change. It is within a word, and both of these are examples of progressive assimilation. L changing because of P, or P changing the quality of L. Now, it can be at a word boundary. The same L sound, for example, becomes devoiced. Why does it get devoiced here? Because of the influence of the T that comes before it. T is a voiceless consonant. So, L also becomes more of a voiceless sound. In other words, a better word to describe that would be a devoiced sound. It loses its voiced quality. At last, the L, you can notice the vibration of the vocal cords is distinctly reduced when you place your fingers over the throat to observe the voice or voiceless quality. So it becomes changed. So this is an example of an assimilatory change involving voice change. It is at word boundary, and it is also an example of a, is it progressive or regressive? It is progressive because L changes because of T, or in other words, T changes the sound that comes after it at last. Now, the third change is one that involves changed lip positions. Assimilation involving changed lip positions. Again, some of these examples would have been discussed already under other heads. But here again, let us look at examples within a word and at word boundaries. The P by itself is a bilabial sound. But when it is followed by an E sound, it becomes a lip spread consonant. P by itself is a bilabial sound with no obvious spreading of lips. You can't say P by itself with a lip spread position. It's a bilabial plosive. But in peel, you notice that there is obviously a lip spread. P takes a lip spread position. Why does it do that? Under the influence of the E sound that comes after it. So this is an example of, again, to use an earlier label, an anticipatory or regressive change, and it is within a word. It is, of course, an allophonic change, not a phonemic change. The lip position of per changes, peel, speed, and so on. Whereas the per becomes a lip rounded sound in pool, spoon, again under the influence of the sound that comes after it. So, oo changes, the per that comes before it. Its lip position changes. Now, the same kind of change may occur at a word boundary. The per becomes lip rounded in tapeworm, tapeworm, under the influence of were, per changes. A regressive or anticipatory change at word boundary involving a changed lip position. Mer, again, is lip rounded in some work, some work. Mer by itself is the bilabial sound, which does not involve any lip rounding, but under the influence of the were sound that comes after it, here it becomes some work, a lip rounded change. It is an anticipatory change again, or a regressive one, and it also is a allophonic change. And the last change is one that involves nasalization. Nasal sounds becoming less nasalized, or non-nasal sounds becoming more nasalized. Again, because of the influence of the neighboring sounds. So within a word, let us look at the way in which the E sound is pronounced in a word like mean, for example. Now, E by itself is a vowel, and we do not have any nasal quality. The air stream does not pass out through the nose in the production of E by itself. But in a word like mean, under the influence of the m that precedes it, and probably also because of the n that comes after it, but more because of the m sound that precedes it, the E changes, and you will notice how it becomes a nasalized sound. Mean. You notice that during that sustained E, you definitely can feel the air passing out through the nose. Mean. Why does that E sound have its airstream passing out through the nose? Why does it become nasalized? Because of the influence of the M sound that comes before it. So this is an example of an assimilation involving nasalization. It is within a word, and it is an example of a progressive change, mer changing the quality of the sound that comes after it. Now it may be at a word boundary, as for example the E sound, which gets nasalized in come in, come in. The E sound there changes because of the mer that comes just before it. So mer changes E, it is a progressive change, it is at a word boundary, it is an assimilatory change, an allophonic assimilatory change involving nasalization. The E vowel sound becomes nasalized. So the different categories and different kinds of changes that we have studied, the 8 different divisions, the 4 categories of change and the 4 kinds of change. That all that involved allophonic changes, where the quality of the sound changes. Now we also need to understand that, as we have said already, the assimilation may involve the change of a whole phoneme. The phoneme itself may change. Again, the change may be within a boundary or at a word boundary. It may be progressive or regressive, but we'll just look at 2 examples of phonemic assimilation. The n, for example, becoming ng in a word like incongruous. We don't say incongruous, we say incongruous. The n there becomes the ng sound under the influence of the k that comes after it. K is a velar sound, n is an alveolar sound. The alveolar sound becomes pushed backward, and it becomes a velar ng, ng, incongruous, incongruous. Ng becoming n becoming n under the influence of the sound that comes after it. So it's a phonemic assimilation. It is within a word. It is an example of a regressive change because n changes because of k that comes after it. In other words, k changes the n before it. So it is a regressive or anticipatory change within a word and a phonemic change. Now, it may be at a word boundary that you can observe the phoneme changing, as for example in the phrase round ticket. In speech, you would normally not hear the d sound there at all. The d would be replaced by a sound like t. So, round ticket, this would be like a full change or full assimilation. Remember the partial and total assimilation. In total, a phonemic assimilation would be a total assimilation. You have the d changing entirely and becoming t. Round ticket, round ticket. It's not round ticket where you have only one sound. There definitely is a sound, but that t, the d changes to t. So it is an example of a phonemic change at a word boundary. So I think we can close our discussion on assimilation and elision here. I would suggest that you go back to these slides and look at the examples and observe for yourself with practice, with self-demonstration, the ways in which the sounds change in speech, the ways in which we can observe changes coming in the way sounds are produced in order to maintain the natural rhythm of speech.